Hello everyone, welcome to this FastAPI crash course tutorial. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the FastAPI framework to create RESTful APIs quickly. So this framework was built for speed, and this is what we're going to demonstrate in this video. And we're going to show you how you can document your API, serialize the data back to JSON, validate your data from the request, as well as many other things. So we've got a lot to cover, so without any further ado, let's jump into the code and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So here we're in our project, so we're going to head to our terminal and initialize our project. So here I'm going to be using Poetry. You can use pip or any other virtual environment manager to install your dependencies and manage your project. So I'm going to say Poetry init. And I'm going to leave the defaults for most of the things. Here I'm not going to specify my dependencies, and I'm going to confirm. So here I want to add my dependencies now. So I'm going to say Poetry add, and we need FastAPI, we need UVcorn because we need a server, and we need email validator to validate emails. So we're going to install all of these dependencies. And we're going to activate our project. So we're going to say Poetry shell. Okay, excellent. We're going to head to our project. So here we're going to create a file called main. And this is a Python file. And in this file, we're going to instantiate our application instance. So we're going to say app is equal to FastAPI. And then we're going to import that from FastAPI. And then what we want to do is run our server. So we're going to say if the name is equal to main, then we want to run our server. And that's from UVcorn. So I'm going to say UVcorn. We're going to import that. And we're going to say run. So we're going to say UVcorn.run. And here we want to pass our application instance. And the way we do this is using a string. So we're going to add a path to our application instance, which is here. And that's within the main file. So we're going to say main, and then we're going to add this colon, and then we're going to say app. And that is enough. And then we're going to specify the host, and we're going to say local host. Then we're going to say port, and we're going to specify the port as 8080. And then one last thing we want is reload, and we want to set that to true because we want our application to reload whenever it picks up any changes. Okay, and that's all we need to do. Now we're going to run the server. So we're going to head to our terminal and we're going to say Python 3, and then we're going to say main.py. And now our application is running on port 8080. So if we head here, we cannot find anything. But if we go to here and we say docs, here we find the FastAPI documentation. And here we have nothing because we haven't created any routes yet. We're going to create a simple route. So we're going to say app. So this is a decorator. And here we're going to say .get, and because we want the HTTP verb to be get, and here let's just specify this as hello. And here we need a function to handle this route. So we're going to call this hello as well. And then we're just going to return a Python dictionary. And here we're going to say hello as the key and world as the value. So we're going to save that. We're going to head back. We're going to refresh this. And here we've got our documentation that tells us that this route exists. And we can try it out even here and execute. And here we get hello world. And we can do the same thing here as well. So we're going to say localhost 8080. And here we're going to say hello. And we get the same thing. So this is how you create routes in FastAPI. In larger applications, you want to group your routes in logical operations. For example, we might have an API and we want that to live under the API namespace. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create another Python package and we're going to call this API. Okay, and here we're going to have a couple of files, one to be specific. So the file we're going to have is our views, and this is where we're going to specify all of our views for our API. So what we want to do here is we want to create a router, and this is the logical grouping in FastAPI. So here we're going to say API is equal to APIRouter. So we're going to import this from FastAPI, we're going to instantiate it, and here we're going to say prefix is equal to /API. So all of the routes that we're going to specify with this API router will be prefixed with /API. So what we want to do first is we want to create a list of users and return them to the frontend. But before we do that, let's register this API router with our main application. So we come here and all we need to do is we need to say app.include router, and we want to specify the router, and then we named it API, and let's import that. So now all of the routes from within here that we specify will be included in our main application. So how do we handle validation in FastAPI? So FastAPI uses Pydantic Models to validate many of your data. So we're going to do the same thing here. So we're going to create another Python package and we're going to call it schemas. And within here, we're going to have a file and we're going to call it user. Okay, so in this file, we're going to have essentially the shape of our users. So we could have users that come in from the request, users that go out of the request, and update users. So we're going to start with users that come in. So we're going to say class user in, and what I mean by users that come in is data that is passed from the frontend or passed to the API. And this will extend base model. And this is a Pydantic model. So essentially, this helps us with validation. So we're going to have a first name, and here we're going to type hint it as a string. And this is what helps with validation. So we're going to say last name, again a string. Again, here we're going to say email, and here we're going to do something different. So we're going to say email str. So we're going to import that from Pydantic email str. So this will validate that this is a valid email. And here we want a password as well. And this will be a string. So this is our user in. However, we don't want to pass the password back to the API. We only want to accept a password whenever we're creating a user. So for user out, we're going to say that this extends base model, and we're going to have similar fields. However, here we're going to have an ID as well, which is an integer, and then we're going to have first name, which is a string, last name, again a string, and email, which is again an email str. Okay, and finally, for updating a user, we only want to update their first name and last name. User, let's just call this update user. This will extend base model. And here we're going to say first name string, last name again is a string. Okay. So now we've got all of our models. Let's go back to our views in our API and create a list of users that we can return to the frontend. So here I'm going to say users is equal to a list. And here we're going to say user out. So we're going to import that. We're going to say ID is equal to 1. And then let's just say first name is equal to John. Last name is equal to Smith. We also need an email. So we're going to say jsmith@gmail.com. Okay, so we want to duplicate this a few times. We're going to create 4 users. We're going to change their IDs. So we can say 2, 3, and 4. The second one is going to be called Jane Doe. So here we're going to say J Doe. And then our next user is going to be Jack Jones, J Jones, and here we're going to say Sarah. And here we're going to leave this to Smith, S Smith. So we've got all of our users. However, if we want to type hint it and help Python understand what type this is, and this is helpful for FastAPI as well, we're going to say that this is a list. We're going to import this from typing, and we're going to say it's a list of user out. Okay. And now we are ready to create our route to return all of our users. So we're going to call this get users. So we're going to say define get users, and here we want to return all of our users. So we're going to decorate this, and we're going to say, so here let's just pass for now, and here we're going to say API.get, and here we're going to say users. So this is going to help us get all of our users. So to begin with, let's just return our users. Okay. So if we head to our browser, we can check and see if this works. So here we want to go to API/users. And here we get our list of users correctly. So this works fine. So if we go to Swagger and refresh here, we get both of our routes. And we see API users get users. So we now get our users. However, if we go to Swagger, here we don't have any valid responses. So we don't see what we get as a return. So we want to essentially help FastAPI understand what we're returning. So we do that by adding a return type. And we're going to say, this is a list of user out. So if we save this and we refresh, here in users, we've got an example. So we get an ID, a first name, a last name, and an email. So now this is more helpful because it knows that we're returning a list of this shape, which is the user out. So now let's move on to creating a user. So we're going to do a similar thing. So we're going to say define, and here we're going to create a user. Okay. Here, however, we need to specify what we need to accept. So here we need a user, and this will be user in. And this is what will create the validation to specify what is required. So here we're going to say API.post because we want the method to be post. And here we're going to say users. And here we're going to say status code as 201 because a successful status code, we want it to be 201. So here we want to return the user. So how do we do that? So we've got to create the user and then we've got to return it. So let's just create a helper function here. Let's call it save user. And this gets a user in, and we essentially want to create a user out, add it to our list, and remove the password and generate an ID for that. So how do we do that? So we grab the data. So we're going to say user data is equal to user, the user that we passed, dot model dump, and this essentially creates a copy. So we want to remove the password, so we're going to say user data dot pop password. So if this was a real life application, we would hash the password and save it in the database, but for simplicity's purposes, we're just going to remove the password. And then we want to say user ID, and we want to get the next available ID. So how do we do that? Is we go to users, we get the last user, and then we get their ID, and then we add 1 to it because we want the next ID. So we're going to go here, we're going to say user out, and we're going to say user out. We're going to create another one. So we're going to say ID is equal to user ID, and then we want to add the rest of the data. So we're going to unpack the user data that we copied here, so that we duplicated here. And then we're going to add this user to the users. So we're going to say users.append user out, and then we just want to return that user. So we're going to say return user out. So this is all we need to do. So here we're going to say user, or just call it user out is equal to save user. We're going to pass in our user, and then we're going to return the user out. And here we want to help FastAPI by type hinting what the return type is. So here we're going to say the return type is user out. However, if we want, we can return the user in a dictionary. However, let's leave it like that for now. So if we go back and we refresh this, we get another endpoint, and this is to create a new user. And we see what the request body is: first name, last name, email, and password. And we see what a successful response is and the return type. So let's head to Postman and create a user. So we're here. Let's create an endpoint. This will be post, and this will be localhost port 8080, and then /API users. And here we need to pass the body. So we're going to head to body, and we're going to head to raw JSON, and here we need to pass what was here. So this thing here. So let's just copy that for simplicity's sake. No, that was the return type. We want this one here. Okay, so first name, let's just create a new user, example, name, or just say Jack, and here we're going to say Doe, J, Jack, Doe, and here the password, let's just put a random password. And if we make the request, we get the user back with the ID 5, the name, the last name, and the email. So if we head back to our API here, if we call this endpoint again, we get the additional user. So now that we have created this user, we've got one more thing to see. So here we were saving the user, but there is a concept called dependency injection in FastAPI. And this is essentially some data that is passed to the request or the query strings, or cookies or headers get passed to a function that you define. So let's just see how this works. So the way this works is you specify here the data that is returned from that function that is called. So here I'm going to say user out. So we don't need this. And here you use the annotated. So we import annotated from typing. And here we need to pass two things. So what is going to get returned from that function? So that is user out. And the second one is depends, which is a function we call. And this is from FastAPI. And we call that function and we say which function does it depend on. So we're going to say save user. We don't call it, we just pass a reference to it. So what this means is that the data will be passed to this function, and that data is the user in schema. And then we are expecting to get a user out of this function. And this is what we do. We get a user out. So we get that user out, and the definition is the same, but it's a bit cleaner. So if we head back to our Swagger UI and we refresh this, we get the exact same thing. So if we head to Postman and try to create a user again, so here I'm going to say Joe, Jack, J Jack, and we make the request. We get 5 because the server restarted, but the user gets created correctly. So if we create another user, we say Jones, J Jones. We get another user correctly. So if we refresh here, we get all of our users. So this works exactly the same way. It's just a cleaner way of doing things and essentially organizing logic together. Okay, so let's move on to the next endpoint, which is to update a user. So here we're going to say API.put, and we want to say users, and here we want to specify the user ID. So here we're going to say user underscore ID. So here we've got to define the function, and we're going to say update user. So here we're going to accept the user ID. We're going to expect it essentially, and we're going to type hint it and say that it's an integer. All right, so what do we want to do here? We want to grab the user from the database or our list, update them, and then return the new user back. So we can do this with the same way that we did before. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say user, and this will be the user out. Okay, let's just leave it as user, and then we're going to say annotated, and here we're going to say it's a user out we're going to return, and here we're going to say depends, and then I'm going to call the function. We haven't created the function yet, but I'm going to call it update user or 404, because if we don't find the user, we want to return a 404. And here I'm going to say, I'm going to do it a bit differently. I'm going to say dictionary, and I want it to be a dictionary of string, and then the value should be user out. And the reason we're doing that is because we want it to have this sort of shape. So we're going to say user, and then here we're going to have the user object. So it's going to be something like this. So let's just go and create this function. So we're going to go here, we're going to say update user or 404, and then what do we need to accept in this function? So we need the user ID. So we're going to say user ID. This should be an integer, all right? And then we also need the update user. So the updates that are passed. So essentially the new first name and the new last name. So we're going to say this is of type update user. And this is the Pydantic model we created earlier. So here we're going to say that the return type is a user out. All right, so, okay, so I made a mistake here. This should have been here. Okay, So here, what we essentially need to do is we need to try and find the user and then update them. So here I'm going to say updated user is equal to none. And then we're going to enumerate our users. So I'm going to say for I, and then user in enumerate users. And then here, what we're going to do is we're going to check the ID. We're going to say if the user.id is equal to the user ID that was passed, then we have found the user. So we're going to say updated user is equal to users of I, because we want to update the user in the list. And we're going to say dot model copy. And then we want to update some fields. And those fields are update dot model dump. So essentially the first name and the last name. And the reason is we're doing it like that is because this will be a dictionary, which is what we want. All right. And here, what we need to do is we want to say users of I is equal to updated user. Okay. Because here we're creating a new user model, and then we want to associate it with at that point in the list. And then all we want to do here is we want to check if in that loop we have found this user. So we're going to say if updated user is none. So essentially we have not found that user. We're going to raise an exception. So I'm going to say raise this is all capital HTTP exception. So we're going to import that from FastAPI. And here we're going to say status code is 404 because we want it to be not found. And then as the detail, we want to say user not found. However, if this is not the case and we have found the user, we want to return it. So we're going to say return updated user. Okay, so we have made a small mistake here. So this should not be a colon, this should be a comma. So we're going to restart our server. We're going to run it. And then we're going to head to our API here in Swagger. We're going to refresh. And here we get put as well. So essentially shows that we need the first name and the last name to update, as well as the user ID. And we can see the successful return type. So if we head to Postman and let's duplicate this request here. Let's make it a put and go to the body. We only need the first and last name. And here we can specify a specific user. If we say 33 and we make the request, we get 404 user not found. So we want to update a user that exists. So we're going to go to, and we're going to say new name. And here we're going to say new last name. So if we make this request, we get the user back. So we get first name, new name, last name, new last name, and the email and ID remain the same. So if we head here and we fetch all of our users, we see that the second user has updated. So the new users have gone because the server has restarted, but if you're using a database, you will not have that issue. But this is for demonstration purposes only. Now we can head and try and delete one of the users that we have in our list. So how do we do that? We're going to say API.delete. And here we're going to say users, and here we need the user ID. Okay, so we're going to define a function and we're going to say delete user. And here we need the user ID, which is an integer. Okay. And here, let's just pass for the time being. So what do we need to do here? We essentially need to delete a user and just return some sort of message. So here we would return something like this. So we return a dictionary with a message, and here we would say user deleted. Okay, but here we need the logic to delete the user. So I'm going to say delete user or 404, and 404 would be if we cannot find that user. So we're going to pass the user ID here, and we need to create this function. And this would be similar to this function here. So we're going to say delete user or 404. We need a user ID, which is an integer. And then we would essentially need to find the user and delete it from the list. So we would say found is equal to false. And then we would have to loop through all of our users. So we're going to say for user in users. And then we would say if user.id is equal to user ID, we would say found is equal to true because we found that user, and then we want to remove them. So we'd say users.remove, and then we'd say user. And then finally, we'd go here and we would say if not found, we would want to raise an exception. So we'd raise an HTTP exception like we did before. We would say status code is 404, and the detail would be user not found. So very similar to previously, and we're essentially deleting the user. If we don't find the user, we don't delete them, and we raise an exception. However, here we can also specify the return type, and this would be similar to what we did here. So it would be a dictionary, and here we would say this would be a string and a string because it's message and user deleted. So if we head back to Swagger and we refresh, okay, we made the same mistake here. This is a comma. Okay, we get delete and the user ID, and here we're essentially saying that we will return a dictionary. Okay, so if we head to Postman and we try and delete a user, so here we're going to say delete, and then we're going to say local host 8080, and then we're going to say API users, and then let's just put a random user, okay, and make the request, and we get user not found. However, if we pass, let's say user of ID 3, which we know exists, it says user deleted. So if we head back here and we refresh, we see that our user has gone, which is what we want. Now that we've been able to delete a user, we also want to be able to fetch one single user. So we're going to go here and we're going to say API.get, and here we're going to say users, and here we want the user underscore ID. And here we want to define a function to fetch a user. So we say get user. And here we need the user ID, which is an integer. And then we want to return that user. So here we can essentially do it in a similar fashion with depends, because we can pass the data to a function which will handle it and then return it to us. So here I'm going to put user instead, and here I'm going to say annotated, and here we're going to say that we're going to pass out a user out, and here we want to say depends, and we want to call a function. So we're going to say get user or 404, and then that would get passed to the function. And here we want to say that the return type is a dictionary, and then we're going to say string, and then user out. Okay, so we're essentially trying to return here. We're going to say user and user, and that's what we need to do. We just need to define this function up here. So we're going to say define get user or 404. So we need the user ID, which is an integer. And here we need to check and see if we can find the user. So what we need to do is we need to say user is equal to next. And then we're going to filter. And here we're going to pass a lambda function. And then we're going to say u.id is equal to user ID. Okay. And here we need the list of users. And then here at next, we're going to pass none as the optional parameter if nothing is found. So we're going to say if the user is none, we want to raise an exception again. We want to say that we have not found the user. So we're going to say HTTP exception. I want to say status code is 404. And the detail is again user not found. However, if we have found the user, we want to return them. And that's all we need to do. So this should work now. So if we head here to Postman, we can go to, let's just create another tab here. We don't want delete, we want get 3. We get the user with ID 3. If we do 44, the user does not exist. So we can fetch users that exist. But if the user does not exist, we get 404. Finally, I want to add some functionality to the user's endpoint here. So when we're fetching the users, ideally I'd want to be able to filter the users. So how should we do that? Well, we can do that with a dependency as well. So we can say filtered users, and here we're going to say annotated. And here, what do we want to get back? We want a list of user out. And then here we want to depend on a function. So we're going to say depends. And then we want to have a function. We're going to call it filter users. And here we want a list of user out again. And here we're just going to return filtered users. Okay, so we just need to create this function here. So let's just create it somewhere here. So I'm going to say filter users. And what do we accept here? So we can accept a couple of query parameters. So query parameters are passed to our method here, like body parameters are. So let's just go here. Let's just pause for a second and think of what we need to filter by. Well, I think we need to filter by the first name, which is, let's annotate it. So we're going to say annotated. It's a string, and we are basically specifying here query. So I'm going to import this, and I'm going to explain what this means. And here we're going to say that the default is none. Okay, so we're going to say is equal to none. All right. So what this basically means is that we are going to accept a argument called first name, and we are annotating. We're basically saying it's of type string, and with this one here, we're basically saying it's located in the query parameters. So it's in the query string of the request, because we could have said body here. We could have said that this is in the body, but we don't want the body. We want the query, because we want query parameters to filter. So I'm going to duplicate this a couple of times. We want to filter by the last name. And again, that's a query. It's none because it's optional. Because if you don't specify none, it's required. But we wanted to make it optional. And here we want to have an email, and it's the same thing. So here we're going to say filtered is equal to our list of users, and now we want to filter them. So we're going to say if first name, so if it's not none, then we want to filter our results. So we're going to reassign this list to filtered and say that it's a list of filter. And then here we want to pass a lambda function, and we're going to say u, and then we're going to say first name in u dot first name, and I'll explain exactly what I'm doing here. Okay, so here we want to pass users. Okay, so what are we doing here? So first we're filtering, we're passing a lambda function, and we are searching in our users to see if the first name that was passed, okay, is anywhere within each of those users' first names. So it can be anywhere, all right? So if this was a database, you would do a case-insensitive search. So, but in this case, we're going to do it this way, okay? And we're going to do the same for the other ones as well. So I'm just going to duplicate this a couple of times. So let's just put this on a new line. Okay. And we're going to do last name. Okay. So here, this would be last name. And here we do email. Okay. So we're essentially, if the query parameter is passed, we're filtering by that. And then what we need to do is just return the filtered list. Okay. And this is all we need to do. So now we would get only the filtered users. So if we go here and we refresh, we get a list of 4 users. However, if we pass a query parameter, we said that we can pass first name is equal. Here, I don't know, let's just see. If I do OH, because OH is in John, okay, like here, OH, that's only that, we get John, okay. However, if I put one letter A, so there's A in Jane, A in Jack, and A in Sarah. Or we could do something like the email. So we want to find all the Gmails, okay? All these users have a Gmail account. So this is the way you use it. And you can use multiple. So I can do the email, and I can also do the first. Let's just do the last name for now. So last name is equal to ON. Okay, so this should have returned less users. So let's have a look at what we did. Okay, so here, this the issue is we need to filter the filtered, not the users. Okay, so if we save this and we retry this, there we go. We only get 1 user that matches this criteria. So something I want to point out is when you annotate return types, or you annotate the signature of a method, essentially you are basically saying that that is going to be the return type and this is going to be what is required. So for example, if we go to create a user, we're saying that this depends on save user, and we're saying that we're expecting a user in. So user in has the first name, last name, email, and password. So if we were to go and create a user and don't specify those fields or specify something wrong, we're going to get a validation error. And this is what is great about FastAPI. So let's try that. So if we head to Postman and we go to post, here we're specifying everything correctly. So however, if I remove the password and I make this request, we get an error. So we're saying field required, and then we're saying that the location should be in the body, and this is password, and it's missing. We could do something similar with the email as well. So let's just try the email, okay? We're not going to omit it, but we're going to do something wrong. Okay, let's just say jjones@com. So this is not a valid email. So if we make the request, we get value error. Where is this error? In the body, it's in the email, and the message is value is not a valid email address. The part after @ is not valid. It should be a period. So essentially, we are validating the data that is passed. So let's just remove this as well. So we get multiple issues. So we get a missing first name, then we get a missing last name, and then we're getting that the email is invalid. So this is what is great about FastAPI and Pydantic Models working together. This is the way you can build a RESTful API using FastAPI with dependencies, APIRouters, and Pydantic Models for data validation. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, please like and subscribe as this helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.